Good morning, Cali.
Hi, Claire. How are you?
I'm good. Welcome to Clarity Conversations.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're here with Cali Yost, CEO and founder of the Flex+strategy group, right? So just by way of introduction, you have spent 2 decades working with organizations on how to reimagine how, when, and where work is done. Good. And before we get into the questions, I want to just make mention of the fact that when I graduated business school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And what's amazing about you is that from the day you finished business school, you knew you wanted to do this. And, you know, it was in the mid 90s, I think.
1995. Yep.
Right. Companies were not buying it and they didn't understand it. And you were dogged and you were committed. And I guess my question is, how did you have that vision at that young age? What was it that got you there?
Well, actually, I've always believed that flexibility is about optimizing business. So I had been a manager, a baby junior manager in training at a bank in New York, the Bank of New York. I went through their manager training program. And I was with a group and I witnessed that people were leaving because they could not get flexibility. And it wasn't just women. There was a man that left for that reason too. And I just saw it made my business vulnerable. My particular group, we lent to closely held companies. So it was very important to have the relationship with the owner of the business. And so when a banker left, they took that relationship with them. And at the time, weirdly, I had started to follow this sort of emerging field of work and family is what it was called. But it was really the part I was interested in was around flexibility. And I went to my leadership and I said, oh, could we let them reduce their schedule? Could we let them work from home? And again, 1993, no, 92, 91. I mean, they were like, I don't even know what that is. What? No. Okay.
Yeah.
And our business was vulnerable. So I just, when it finally kind of all came to a head is, this is an important part of the story. I went to introduce myself to one of the clients of one of the people who had left, and a CEO of a bank who was the client of one of the people who left because they didn't have flexibility. I went to introduce myself to him and he said, you know, this is a huge mistake. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, at my bank, we give them flexibility and they stay forever. And it was like one of those moments where like the angels started singing. And here's a man in his early 60s who was saying, you know what, this is how we have to operate my organization. And I thought, this is going to be a thing. I mean, this is real. So I am going to go back to business school, get an MBA so that the senior leaders of organizations take me seriously and take what I'm saying seriously. And that's kind of how it all began.
Wow, amazing. And
I
it
know.
really is. I mean, you wonder sometimes, that story tells me like maybe there was a time when work flexibility wasn't so challenging, you know, but somehow the 80s, 90s really made this like machine that was totally inflexible.
Yeah. You know, I think what was the key in his situation was he was the CEO saying, this is what we're going to do. They
Yep.
didn't get all boxed up into the policy around it yet. I think what happened was it got kind of productized and policyized, like it got shifted to the HR department and we started to try to put all these rules around it and make it all like, and that's not what flexibility
Very
is.
dehumanizing.
Well, I think we wanted to, I don't even know how it happened, honestly. I think it just needed to go somewhere. So they put it in HR.
Yep.
And HR, sure, there are going to be some policies around it, but really this is the way you operate your organization. This is a way of working. And I believe when he would explain to me how they implemented what they were doing, that's how he saw it. And I think what we ended up doing is we ended up putting a lot of rules around it and making it very rigid. And so basically it had no impact. And people say to me, but we have policies. It's like, if those policies worked, every organization would have pivoted without a problem with the pandemic, and they didn't. And hundreds of thousands of women would not have left the workforce if those policies worked. So they
Yes.
don't work. They are just written words on a website. You now need to operationalize that way of rethinking how, when, and where somebody's going to do their job. And that's where we're going post-COVID, because that's what ultimately this is going to be about.
Okay, great. So let's talk about COVID, because I think, you know, we all know that this is now, you are like the woman of the hour this year.
I don't know about that, but I definitely am very grateful that I can bring my experience to the table, for sure. Yeah.
Great. Well, what are what are the big learnings, first of all? You know, what have you been telling organizations all along that they finally got this year?
That flexibility is a way of operating, because organizations would not have been in business the last year and a half if they were not operating in a much more flexible, dynamic way. Practically overnight, they threw people into their work from home mode that had never done it. They had leaders leading across flexible teams where they had some people working from home. They had some people having to do staggered shifts because they couldn't be in the same space together at the same time. It was just a very forced, rapid pilot of something that they resisted for so long because they were afraid. They thought chaos would ensue. They were afraid productivity would go down. It actually was maintained, and in many cases went up. And there was an inertia that things were basically fine. It was fine. You know, why mess things up? Why rock the boat? The organizations that did make the change pre-pandemic saw the trend coming. They already knew that young people wanted, expected, and will not stay with you if they do not get flexibility. They understood that there was a way to optimize how they're using workspace much more effectively than they were, optimizing technology much more effectively than they were. And so now leaders are facing a choice. Do you now take this forced pilot and leverage those lessons and now put the strategy and structure in place to operationalize a new way of working going forward? Or do you now just revert back to some pre-pandemic ineffective norm that's going to be so much harder to unwind? Like, this is the moment for you to say, all right, what do we want to recapture from what we did before? Because yes, people want to be together. This is the other thing. No, I'm hearing very few people say, once it's safe.
Never want to go back, right?
I see very few people saying, once I feel safe, and that's really important, because there is a cohort of people right now who do not feel safe to go back into the office full time. But once it's safe, I do want to go in at least 2 or 3 days a week. That's most people.
Yep.
So how do you move past your concern about leading a remote team? Because you're not going to be leading a remote team. There could be some people who are remote. And how do you now move forward in that model? What does that look like?
So I want to make a distinction, because you've said policy versus operationalize. And I would imagine that part of the difference in there is like trust, relationships, who you feel good about, whose work ethic you trust. But what can you pinpoint that are the distinctions within those two, or between those two?
So it's easy. It comes down to a question. What do we need to get done, and how and where do we do it best? And just asking that over and over and over again, and allowing the organization to adjust depending upon what the answer is to that question. And there are going to be guardrails that you put in place based upon particular jobs. Those guardrails are probably going to be mostly norms and guidelines that guide a planning, a coordination, an execution process in an organized way, but they're not rules. There's not a one size fits all rule that's going to apply to everybody. And it's probably going to be a lot of shifting depending upon the realities of a particular business and what's going on at a particular time. So that's the difference between a way of operating and a policy.
Okay, so then within that, what principles have you seen are the most effective? Which companies, you said the ones that had kind of preloaded this have been more successful, but what are the principles and what are some of the winning strategies that you've seen?
So when it comes to principles, I'd say there are actually three elements to a successful high performance flexible operating model, which is what we implement. Okay. And high performance defined as the business is performing optimally, but also people are performing optimally. And that includes their well-being. Okay. So the three elements that have to be in place are obviously the infrastructure of flexible work. So that it does include the guardrails around where people are going to work. You got to establish that. What's the right mix of on-site and remote based upon the work that we do? Then you've got to look at the space. What kind of spaces are we working in when we are on site and what we are working in when we are remote? Then you want to look at the time. When are we working? We're working across time zones. How are we intentional about that? And then you also have to look at technology. How are you using technology? This is a mess. Technology is a mess in most organizations. It was adopted rapidly. There's not a lot of organization to it. There's not a lot of consistency in what type of technology you're using when. That has to be clarified. So that's sort of the infrastructure part you want to set up. Then you want to look at the culture, and managers, teams, and individuals have to share leadership in a flexible work model. You can't just rely on managers. They play a role, but you can't rely on them solely to execute this. So the principles there are share accountability. We share accountability. We plan and coordinate our updates and priorities. We have our priorities clear. We give updates. Then we take that information and we're very intentional about planning how, when, and where we're going to work. We coordinate with each other and collaborate, and then we recalibrate as realities change. So all of those core principles are then implemented as part of the structure of that culture of shared leadership. So you have a cadence with managers and employees. We are we are clarifying priorities. We are providing updates. That is not happening in so many places. And you'd think that would be basic. But then from that basic information, the individual then has to say, what have I got to get done? And how, when, and where do I do that best? And how do I coordinate with the people who work with me so that we get the job done well? And that cycle continues over and over. And then the final piece is you have to align the enterprise around this new way of working. And that gets back to leadership and leaders mirroring this new flexibility in themselves, rewarding other leaders and individuals who work in a flexible, dynamic way successfully, aligning IT strategy, aligning facility strategy, and then aligning the HR policies and procedures so that it supports this new flexible work model. So, people say to me, oh my gosh, that's a lot. It's like, okay, it's a system of change that is multifaceted, but if you know what the elements are, then you can begin to execute them in an intentional way. And soon enough, they will all come together in this coordinated new way of operating that then you just sustain. And that's the other piece of this. I think there's a tendency to want to sort of lock, load, and be done with it. And that's not the way it works. Like, you're always going to want to be evolving how you work going forward.
Yep. I love this idea of the principle, the operational, and where I wanted to go, which is crazy, is, all those years ago, I won't say how many, when we were in business school, they were still talking about the all-knowing leader. And so some companies are still up there going, we're the all-knowing leader. So they're sort of like dead in the water, right? And the other companies that have this figured out, that have already shared leadership for a long time, they're the ones that have taken the lead. And I'm seeing some amazing examples in the companies that I work with that they are doing an amazing job. And it's not just, it goes beyond like, you can show up between 8 and 8:30 and leave between 5:30.
Right. Yeah. It's like, tell us what you think you're going to do, how you're going to work to be most effective. But I think the key is, and one of the things I get worried about is I hear a lot about the employee determining how, when, and where they work best, and for sure. but you still have to coordinate with everybody you work with. Okay. So
Absolutely.
it has to be
Yes.
manager playing their role and knowing how to lead a flexible work team. And there are certain competencies related to that. Then it's also the individual then taking that information and being intentional, but you really do need to coordinate with people that you work with.
Yes.
And I don't hear that enough. It all has to kind of hang together.
Yeah. And there's an accountability piece, because I'll tell you, in the work that I do, I work a lot with middle managers and then senior managers also. But there's a little bit of like, that middle manager needs to also show up with maturity. You know, if they're getting this privilege, there's also accountability, as you say, to keep people in the loop, right? To all get on the same page and to do the extra work that's required so that they can have the, you know, and I don't even want to call it a privilege. It's almost like a necessary, particularly for working mothers, that they have this. But there's also a level of accountability that and personal willingness that goes with it.
Well, I think it's coming to terms with the fact of what it means to be a leader in today's world, right? And
Yeah.
we go through this exercise that is super effective with managers and leaders. Is it's called prices and payoffs, right? Because this can feel like more work. Okay, like this is more work for me. I have to be much more planful about what we're doing. I have to have actual metrics that
Yeah.
I'm measuring towards. It's a whole lot easier to see somebody walk in the door every day and say, "Oh, they're doing a good job," right? Like you kind of have to do more work if you're a manager. But you know what? Truly, everybody's got to do some more work. Like, I
Yes.
can't just be the person who shows up every day and says, okay, now I'm at work. Now I'm going to work. Like, you got to be more thoughtful, even as an individual.
Yes.
And yeah, the team's got to talk to each other. Like, you got to talk to each other and say, okay, so what are we all trying to get done? And how are we going to coordinate this too? Like, so everybody's got an extra layer of intention that they've got to put around this. But then you have to ask yourself, okay, maybe those are the prices I pay.
Yep.
But what's my payoff on the other side of all
Yes.
of this? And all of a
Yep.
sudden you start to see, all right, yep, I got to plan better. I got to be more thoughtful about what I'm measuring. I have to communicate more effectively. I have to engage people across different platforms and dimensions. All right, you know what? That's more work for me. But on the
Mhm.
other side, I get more productivity. I get more engagement. I get better talent. I hold on to my talent. I don't have
Yeah.
to retrain people. I don't, you start to, I can respond and pivot when a pandemic hits so we can keep
Yes.
operating. I'd say all of a sudden you start laying out these payoffs and the price just starts to seem worth it,
Yeah.
right?
Awesome. So that brings me to the question, when we're talking about this accountability, when somebody is a middle manager or not the very, very, very top C-suite, or even someone in the C-suite, how do you pitch this? How do you pitch flexible work? And I know I almost like, can I withdraw my question? Because the truth is we just saw it happen this year. So I don't know that anybody needs to be convinced anymore, but
They do.
yeah, okay, good. So
Oh, they do.
how does someone pitch this to a senior leadership that may not be convinced?
Okay, so pre-pandemic, people have asked me, so who are these people you worked with? Like, what was the difference between the leaders that you worked with before and those now? The difference was they understood this was about their business. This was just
Yep.
hard numbers for them. Again, I said they realized they were not attracting and retaining the best people. They realized that they were not optimizing their resources. They realized oftentimes that there was a lack of innovation in the way people were
Yes.
working that they wanted to promote. I mean, they got it. Okay. Now the pitch really is, what are you going back to? Like, ship has sailed. Like,
Mhm.
tell me what you're going back to, because it doesn't exist anymore.
Mhm.
And when you start to walk them through that, and then you start to say, this is about your business, and then you
Yeah.
show them that this is about operating resilience during a pandemic. This is about productivity. This is about performance. This is about engagement. This is about talent. This is what this looks like. Then they start to say, you know what? Okay, how do we do this? That's the major block, is they don't know how to execute this next stage. And once you can lay out, here's the business case, here's the process, then there's an openness to say, okay, we got to do this.
Yep.
But I don't think we're doing a great job. I think we're talking way too much about 100% remote work. And do leaders think that's awesome? No, they don't. And they shouldn't, because that is not the way most organizations are going to operate. And if you're a teeny tiny tech company that wants to go remote, and I love GitLab, I think that is a great example of a bigger tech company that is fully remote, but they've got like a 700-page guide that everybody has to remember. And, that's not going to happen in most organizations.
No. Right.
So we have to start saying on the other side of this, presence will still happen. 2 to 3 days a week on average, you're going to have a portion of your workforce that is there. How are you going to use those days for what? And then rethink your model from that place.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Last question. And as honestly, as an extrovert in the room, I will say that, work from home is not the best. It's hard for people who are extroverted. I think the introverts have had a great time, but the rest of us have really struggled. So here is my last question. A few years ago, a friend at a very forward-thinking company created this beautiful open work plan. And, because we've talked a lot about time and flexible time and where you're working, but within the where,
there's the space
plan for, and what I heard from her was that it all sounded great and they had these consultants come in and tell them how great it was, but everything from, I can't job interview for another job because
no, it's a horror show. It was an absolute horror show.
Right. To like, I can't have a private conversation. And like, when my bestie comes over to talk to me to say, let's go to lunch, or to whisper some little thing to me, everybody knows.
Yeah.
So now everybody's doing IMing on the computer. It's like, and I can tell you, sorry, this is less a question than a comment. I can see I'm getting in there, but I do want to hear your opinion. But having been at home with my kids in a New York City apartment for a year, I can tell you that you need a little, right? That Virginia Woolf said, a woman needs a room of her own. I've never needed it more than this year. So open plans, what are your thoughts?
I think there is a place for an open configuration, as long as it is dedicated to a collaborative work.
Yes.
So then there needs to be space in an office that is for heads down private work.
Privacy.
And there needs to be enough of that. And so this is why I'm very worried when I hear leaders say, getting rid of 25% of our workspace. I'm like, yeah, why don't you wait on that a bit? Because I'm not sure yet how people are going to work. And you may need the same space, but you need to configure it differently so that when people are on site, they have the collaborative spaces where you don't care if people can overhear you because you're talking to a team anyway, and it's fine. And, I would still argue teams need walls so that they can be loud and not interrupt everybody else's team meeting. But then you want to still have the spaces where people can feel like they can at least be productive and not interrupted all the time when they're on site. Now, that doesn't have to be a dedicated desk. So this is the one thing I will say. I do not believe that we are going back to dedicated offices and desks. I think what we are going to have is more private spaces, but they will be bookable spaces. I think even senior leaders, when they're not on site, are going to have to put their offices up as bookable.
And you might have like a file cabinet for each employee. Correct. But the desk belongs to everyone.
Yeah. And you may have a neighborhood that your group works within. So it's not like the whole world is coming into the same space. But the point is, there's privacy. It's bookable private space for when you're in the office and you need that. There's open space that's collaborative when your team needs to have that. There's even collaborative spaces that are also more private so that you can maybe have a more private team conversation. but it's going to be a different configuration.
Yeah.
It is.
And I think honestly, that privacy is big, and boundaries, because as a coach, it's been very moving to me to see people this year, not everyone, but enough, that said, I never knew I could say to people, I need 2 hours by myself,
Yeah.
and it's been, and I hope and want for those people that when they do go back, that they will have, that they don't feel so pressured to constantly have an open door policy when many people who are introverted need that quiet time, because that is where their creativity happens. And they're constantly stressed by the noise and distraction. And others invite the noise and distraction because they're sort of verbal processors, out loud thinkers. But yeah, I think there's something also of respecting. We've learned over this year how the context has made different work styles emerge in different ways. And I really hope that people learn to be able to ask for what they need.
So remember when I said that those skills for the individual is being intentional about what it is they need to get done and how, when, and where do they do it best? That's what I'm talking about. Okay. Is that you know what your priorities are, and you are saying, okay, based upon what I need to get done, if I'm an introvert and I need space, and however our office is configured, that does not allow me to be creative and focused. So you know what? I'm going to work remotely for these days, right? And oh, team, here's how I'm going to coordinate with you. Here's how you're going to reach me. Here's how I will respond to you. Here's how we will. That's great. That's great. And so that's what the individual needs to bring to the table now. A manager can't do that. And this is where I get nervous for managers, because I think we're talking a lot about what managers have to do. A manager can't coordinate all that across all the people that work for them. All they can do is say, this is what we need to get done. And then each of us has to say, okay, based on that, this is what I think. These are within the guardrails set for my job. This is how I think I need to work to get that done well.
And that can be challenging for a junior level person, to have the confidence and the wherewithal to speak up and say, this is what I need, boss.
But that's why it has to be a way of operating. That's why it's got to be just understood. This is what we all do. We all are doing this, right? Even the most junior person. And I think one of the things I've seen with junior people is there is a legitimate concern on the part of managers about being able to oversee them, to give them the guidance that they need, to coach them. And so I do think that maybe a junior person might have a different set of guardrails around how they can work. But even within that, because one of my favorite stories is a leader saying, I have all these junior people that work for me, and I'm cool if they're working at home, but they need to know I am in bed by 9:30. I am not responding to their texts at 11 o'clock at night, right? So, that's the coordination that has to happen. But again, that's what we all will bring to the table in that culture of shared leadership.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so all of this is just bringing up like 6 other questions that I could ask you, but I know we have to stop. So I want to thank you, Cali, for being here and for bringing us clarity on this topic. And I look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay, thank you, Claire. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome.